dog. Just wanted to just make quick videos, just some thoughts, that I have. I'll just show off these books very quick. These ones just have to do with just going against what they call the economic interpretation of the Constitution by some guy named Charles Baird. Yeah, this one's from Robert Brown, called Charles Baird and the Constitution, a critical analysis of, quote, an economic interpretation of the Constitution, end quote. Looks like that. It's a little book. It says, it's from a quote in the back. It has a quote from Edward Kirkland. Just saying, it says, ever since its appearance in 1913, Baird's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States has engendered different opinions. This is now R.E. Brown. Attempts the first full-scale analysis of this controversial volume. His dissection of Baird's work, chapter by chapter, reveals the thoroughness of the detail. So Brown's chief emphasis is on Baird's historical methods, such an examination is certainly called for. He concludes in sum that Baird's argument in places is inherently inconsistent, that Baird quoted out of context or omitted quotations damaging to his case, that he relied primarily upon secondary works, that his resort to such sources as he utilized was chronologically faulty, and that he drew conclusions from evidence that he himself admitted did not exist, that he used keywords like coup d'etat and disfranchised without precise definition, that he often substituted inference and innuendo for fact. The evidence he assembled is impressive, and American historians, particularly those who have given lectures or written books based on the Baird thesis, ignore Brown's book at their peril, end quote. So it deals with his understanding of the Constitution. This one's another book that addresses him, called We the People by Forrest McDonald. This is the economic origins of the Constitution. Looks like that. This one's a bit thicker. It goes over the same, addressing the economic interpretation. And I think this one does as well, called Interpreting the Founding, Guide to the Founding. Interpreting the Founding, Guide to the Enduring Debates over the Origins and Foundations of the American Republic by Alan Gibson. Looks like that. It's a bit thinner. And they all deal with that understanding of the Constitution. Basically, it was like, I guess Charles Baird's understanding was that it was mainly about, white people getting rich or something. It just looks at it from that kind of variable, and so it causes all sorts of distortions. And I just want to show off those quick books. And then this other one, Beyond Toleration, The Religious Origins of American Pluralism. This was from Chris Benicki, if I said that correctly. Looks like that. It just goes over the history of the pluralism, right? Because I think I got this like a day ago. I haven't read it yet, so I just wanted to just I don't know, it just looked interesting, so I bought it. Like some of its contents is it says the plague of dissent and the rise of toleration. Partial judgments and divided churches, America's first great awakening, open to all parties, the ordeal of religious integration. It says none are tolerated, the rise of religious liberty, equality or nothing, religious pluralism in the founding of the Republic. And it has a conclusion. Mingle with us as Americans, religious pluralism after the founding. Let me see. So I'll just read briefly. I just want to read briefly from this one. says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Exodus 20:30. Yeah, I mean Exodus 23, right? Let me just get my glasses. I'm just tired. Yeah, it gives you a quote from Exodus 23, and then it quotes the First Amendment of the Constitution right underneath it. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." And it goes on to talk about, like it says, on a visit to Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, George Washington received the usual assortment of welcome messages from the local Protestant clergy, from the local Freemasons, and from citizens who assembled at the town meeting. In addition, the town's Hebrew congregation wished the president well and praised the federal government, which offered bigotry to no sanction and persecution no assistance. This is the Jewish population in Newport was small. Approximately 25 families made their homes there during the Revolution, but they were not ignored. And it says Washington issued a prompt and characteristically polite reply. After acknowledging the kind of sentiments extended to him and expressing his own hopes for the nation's success, the founding father proceeded to make a point regarding the national government's approach to religious diversity. Quote, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of," he wrote, quote, "This is as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherited natural rights," end quote. It says, quote, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance," end quote. Washington repeated, quote, "requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, and giving it on all occasions their effectual support," end quote. The Jews of Newport and the President of the United States agreed neither persecution nor bigotry would find a home in this land that welcomed all, quote, "good citizens," end quote, of whatever faith they might be. Persecution was about to be made unconstitutional, and bigotry had been rendered culturally unacceptable. This has no longer made sense to talk of toleration. And so that's let me see. It just says here, like, in the flap. And it says, at its founding, the United States was one of the most religiously diverse places in the world. Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, Lutherans, Huguenots, Dunkers, Jews, Moravians, and Mennonites populated the nation's towns and villages. Dozens of new denominations would emerge over the succeeding years, and this is what allowed people of so many different faiths to forge a nation together, like what allowed it. And this is in this richly told story of ideas. Chris Binick demonstrates how the United States managed to overcome the religious violence and bigotry that characterized much of early modern Europe and America. The key, Binick argues, does not lie solely in the protection of religious freedom. Instead, he reveals how American culture was transformed to accommodate the religious differences within it. The expansion of individual rights, the mixing of believers and churches in the same institutions, and the introduction of more civility into public life all played an instrumental role in creating the religious pluralism for which the United States has become renowned. These changes also established important precedents for future civil rights movements in which dignity as much as equality would be at stake. So we just said Beyond Toleration is the first book to offer a systematic explanation of how early Americans learned to live with differences in matters of the highest importance to them, and how they found a way to articulate these differences civilly. Today, when religious conflicts once again pose a great danger to democratic experiments across the globe, Binique's book serves as a timely reminder of how one country moved past toleration toward religious pluralism. So it's basically about pluralism, I guess. So I'm just looking at the origins of it. So I bought it because it's interesting. I bought another book on the religious origins of the French Revolution, but hasn't come in yet, so I have to wait on that. The book that I want to read from was from this one. It's called The Religious Origins of the American Revolution. This is edited by Paige Smith. Just has a basic like this cover, looks like that. And there's just nothing on the back. And it just has to do with the American consciousness. And I just read a bit from has a decent size introduction. So far I was like reading from it a little bit, and I know I like a lot of the stuff it said, even though it's like there's a big emphasis on Calvinism and stuff, but that represents more of like the colonies. Is more of the spiritual follower of the Protestant theocrats, but the Republic, I want it centered more on Christ himself. But let me just, I guess, read some of the introduction. It's like, to kind of give you an example of like some of the stuff it talks about the religious origins of the Revolution of America, American Revolutionary War. And because I see a bunch of people trying to interpret it without the Christian heritage, and it just causes all sorts of distortions. And to me, it's like, the secularists, to me, it's like they do the same thing as what the Christian nationalist is trying to do, right? Or even the woke person or the Marxist type, right? Trying to impose a consciousness on the country in order to interpret itself as in a certain way, right? Of course, I would side with the Christian understanding of the country, but not according to like everyone's understanding of Christian. Like, this is why I emphasize the American covenantalism, because I think that is different. Like, I think that is different from Christian nationalism. Like, Christian nationalism is ambiguous, right? It's like there's different types of Christians, and they all have their form of Christian nationalism. Like, they're very nationalistic for their churches, right? Which excludes the founding, where they try to interpret the founding according to what is favorable to their church, right? And so that's why I don't really side with Christian nationalists. Like, I'm more of an American covenantalist, like if that's a position, because you have to account for the American consciousness, like I see it, like the biblical consciousness, like that's what I see, like the American reality, like American covenantalism, like chosen nation, American exceptionalism, the gospel of Christ, kingdom and covenant. I think all that was important to the founders, but not the Protestant popedom or Catholic popery, which is tied to the Christian authoritarianism of their understanding of what a Christian nation is. And it's just I would agree, it is a different Christian consciousness, right? That is rooted in a different kingdom in a different time. And America's, I would say, stands on her own as like an American Christian nation, not just a Christian nation, because the Christian nation is too ambiguous. Like, we know what is Christian, because this all started with the question, like, what is Christian? Like, why should I have to like put on the consciousness of strict Protestantism or strict Orthodoxy or Catholicism, right, with its constraints? Like, it comes with a lot of constraints, and it's just incompatible with the American reality and the American liberty. And so, like, this is why I kind of oppose like blasphemy as well, like blasphemy law. Like blasphemy laws, right? I was reading from that book on blasphemy by Livy. I'll probably read a little bit more on like the section on the American colonists. Just American blasphemy. I'm talking about like blasphemy laws and all that. Like, I would agree, it's more like you're kind of dictating in a different way, right? Other people's religion, so to say, but according to opinion, like dogma, like the Trinity, or denying the deity of Jesus, things like that. Like, it's not like I think there is a difference between eternal truths, right? Christian truths, or eternal divine truths, divine principles of Christ, in comparison to religious opinions, which are the dogmas, which is what is the thing that, I guess got people killed because they were perceived as blasphemers, right? Which is another problem. Like, what is blasphemy? How do you know it's blasphemy? Like, how do you know it's true? How do you know it's not like what you believe? Like, how do you know the blasphemer is not the one persecuting people, right? Like, how do you know the heretic is not the one doing those things? Like, I don't know. It calls into question, like, who gets to dictate what is blasphemy and how do we know it's actually blasphemous? Because a lot of people died over those, like denying certain dogmas and thought worthy of death, right? And it could not even be true, and yet innocent people die, right? Because of a religious consciousness or something, or the mind of the church, the way they understand themselves. But anyway, like, where was I on? Yeah, I was going to read some of the introduction and give you an idea like what this book talks about. Sorry, I know I rambled a bit there, but so it says like, it has become a commonplace to state that Christianity is or was a radical religion, that in comparison with the other world religions it contained a principle or a set of dogmas and doctrines which were intended to work a radical change in the world, that it contained other doctrines that worked to quite different ends is also clear enough. But through much of the last 2,000 years, the Christian doctrines tending to produce change have predominated over those tending to preserve the status quo. Moreover, Christianity evidenced a striking capacity for renewal and regeneration, so that when the institutional church showed signs of rigidity and calcification, reform movements took place that stimulated change in the church itself. So the Protestant Reformation was such a movement of reform within the Christian church. It proved to be the most radical reforming of the church in its long history. And this is Arnold Toynbee has written that the American Revolution was made possible by American Protestantism. That very simply is the assumption on which this ontology is based. The assumption is perhaps best stated as proposition. The Protestant Reformation produced a new kind of consciousness, a new kind of man. The English colonies of America in turn produced a new and unique strain of the new consciousness. It thus follows that it is impossible to understand the intellectual and moral forces behind the American Revolution without understanding the role that Protestant Christianity played in shaping the ideals and principles and institutions of colonial America. This is the American Revolution. Might thus be said to have started, in a sense, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. It received a substantial part of its theological and philosophical underpinnings from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and much of its social theory from the Puritan Revolution of 1640 through 1660, and perhaps less obviously from the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Put another way, the American Revolution is inconceivable in the absence of the context of ideas which have constituted radical Christianity. The leaders of the Revolution in every colony were imbued with the precepts of the Reformed faith, even though in many specific instances Christian orthodoxy was modified by Enlightenment ideas. There was a kind of irreducible stratum of Christian doctrines, or none at all. Well, when Luther made his dramatic gesture of defiance in 1517, he did more than attack specific abuses in the Roman Church. He struck at some of its basic dogmas. He insisted, for instance, that a man or woman could find salvation only through faith. And perhaps most significant in its effects on the settlers of the New World, Luther held that the individual was wholly responsible for his own salvation. So if Luther was the originator of the Reformation, John Calvin was its most formidable theorist. In his Institutes, Calvin presented the doctrinal basis of the branch of the Reformation that, as Calvinism became the foundation of American Puritanism, the Institutes was, in effect, the charter for a new kind of consciousness, a new way of looking at the world and one's fellows, as well as a new way of understanding the relationship of the individual to the divine. Before the Reformation, people had belonged most typically to orders, to social groups and classes, to communes and communities, estates by which they were defined and which set the boundaries of their worlds and established their identities. They were clerks, aristocrats, priests, artisans, members of guilds, of burghs. No one had to live in doubt or uncertainty about his or her place in the world. That place was defined and codified, represented practically and symbolically in 100 different ways. If such individuals understood the general principles that govern their places in the earthly order of things, they also had reference to an equally specific set of rules regarding their place in the heavenly kingdom. They were incorporated part of a social body. It followed that medieval man did not think of himself as an individual. He thought of himself as a member of one of the clearly established orders of society. These traditional orders did not so much submerge him as define and protect him. Above all, they contained him. Luther and Calvin, by postulating a single individual soul responsible for itself, plucked a new human type out of this traditional order and put him down naked, a reformed individual in a reformed world. The doctrine of a priesthood of believers, which each person responsible directly to God for his or her own spiritual state, brought new burdens for the individual psyche, but it brought remarkable new opportunities as well. The individuals who formed the new congregations established their own churches, chose their own ministers, and managed their own affairs without reference to an ecclesiastical hierarchy. Thus there appeared modern man, or his essential integument, an introspect, aggressive individual who was able to function remarkably well outside these ordered structures that had defined people's roles and given them whatever power they possess. This is what this transformation meant, was an almost incalculable release of new human energy into the stream of history. Put another way, Luther and Calvin invented the individual, and these individuals, at least relatively secure in their relationship to God and confident of their own powers, worked remarkable changes in the world. This new individual proved almost equally adept at founding new sects and denominations, as well as new financial enterprises and indeed entire new communities. One of the obvious byproducts was the notion of a contract entered into by two people or by the members of a community among themselves that needed no legal sanctions to make it binding. This concept of the reformers made possible the formation of contractual, or as the Puritans called them, covenanted, groups, formed by individuals who signed a covenant or agreement to found a community. The most famous of these covenants was the Mayflower Compact, and in it the Pilgrims formed a civil body politic and promised to obey the laws their own government might pass. In short, the individual pilgrim invented on the spot a new community, one that would be ruled by laws of its making. The reformers maintained that the Roman Catholic Church, by reserving to itself, to its priests and functionaries, all the doctrines and teachings of the Church, had kept people locked up in rituals and ceremonies which, as Calvin put it, condemned, the miserable multitude, of believers to, the grossest ignorance, faith, Calvin went on, consists not in ignorance but in knowledge, The faithful must know at first hand the Word of God. The only infallible way of knowing God's Word was to read and study it as it appeared in the Holy Scripture. It followed that knowledge rather than authority was essential to an enlightened faith. The importance of the Reformers' emphasis on the literacy of all the faithful was recognized by Massachusetts lawyer, patriot John Adams. They, the Reformers, were convinced from history and their own experience, he wrote, that nothing could preserve their posterity from encroachments of the two systems of tyranny, the Roman Church and the English monarch. But knowledge diffused generally through the whole body of the people. Their civil and religious principles therefore conspired to prompt them to use every measure and take every precaution in their power to propagate and perpetuate knowledge. For this purpose they laid very early the foundations of colleges, and it is remarkable that they have left among their posterity so universal an affection and veneration for those seminaries and for liberal education, and that the meanest of the people contribute cheerfully to the support and maintenance of them every year, so that the education of all ranks of people was made in the care and expanse of the public in a manner that I believe has been unknown to any other people, ancient or modern. End quote. One of the most fundamental changes wrought by the Reformation was to give the family unit an importance that it had never enjoyed before. In the new Reformed family, the father assumed the priestly duties once performed by the church. He usually led family prayers, read the Bible aloud in the vernacular, and even assumed certain teaching responsibilities. The family, as the essential unit and center of Christian life, took on a new dignity and power, and it was as though the power of the institutional church had been divided up among the reconstituted families of the protesting faith. This change in the family also promoted the freedom of the individual, and doing so, it served to release new energies in society, to create new enterprises and new wealth. As in traditional European societies, sons characteristically expressed their loyalty to their fathers by following the same trade or calling. However, since the son in the new family learned the most crucial truths, those necessary for the salvation of the soul, from his father, he was relieved of the burden of loyalty in other spheres, becoming free to go beyond his father in terms of his own worldly ambition. If his father was a carpenter or farmer, the son might aspire to be a lawyer or a merchant without feeling that he was rejecting his father. On the contrary, the son might best express his gratitude for his father's guidance by going beyond what his father had achieved. The result was a great increase in what we have come to call social mobility. The impetus to get ahead in the world grew out of the new faith. Calvin placed great emphasis on the work a man did as a way of serving and pleasing God. His work was not a sure road to salvation. For Calvin, it was a strict predestinarian. He believed salvation was bestowed by God according to his inscrutable plan and could not be earned by either faithful works, but to work conscientiously and well at any task, however menial, was to praise and bear witness to the goodness of the Lord. The consequences are familiar. Protestant countries, and perhaps most characteristically America, as the most Protestant of all countries, have been work-orientated. Work has been the major American preoccupation, or indeed obsession, and an avenue to secular salvation, a vindication of the individual and of individualism itself. Closely related to the ethic of work was Calvin's view of time. Time was seen as an arena in which one worked out so far as possible one's own salvation. All time was impregnated with the divine spirit. Everything done in time and with time came under God's scrutiny. None of it was private or neutral or unobserved. Time must therefore be used carefully, prudently, profitably, devoutly, every hour, every minute of it accounted for, and none wasted. Benjamin Franklin produced dozens of aphorisms exalting this concept. Quote, early to bed and early to rise, end quote. Quote, the devil makes work for idle hands, end quote. Indeed, Americans like Franklin often seem to feel that work and its hoped for concomitant money was a surer path to salvation and piety. This typically American attitude towards time had important ramifications and consequences. The notion of time as God's time that had to be filled up with useful activities and regularly accounted for to God, created a vast new source of human energy. In America, it resulted in an, quote, energy pool, end quote, that perhaps that made possible the domesticating of a wilderness in a remarkably brief time. Perhaps, above all, it robbed the future of its menace, future time, because it was God's time, was not threatening, not full of danger and uncertainty, but full of promise, full of expectation of the revealing of God's plan for man, and of man's faithful response. The federal Constitution was, in this sense, a monument to the Reformed consciousness. This new sense of time as potentiality was a vital element in the new consciousness that was to make a revolution and, what was a good deal more difficult, form a new nation. Austerity, reserve, self-denial were also demanded by Calvin. The reformer took thought for the morrow. He laid something by to care for himself and his less fortunate fellows. He enjoyed the good gifts of God, but with restraint. In Calvin's words, good Christians, quote, should indulge themselves as little as possible. They should perpetually and resolutely exert themselves to retrench all superfluities and to restrain luxury, and they should diligently beware lest they pervert into impediments things which were given for their assistance. End quote. It says Calvin did not require excessive austerity. This would have been a denial of the bounty and generosity of the Maker. But license was a sensible perversion of means into ends. Such preoccupations led quite naturally to an extreme degree of self-consciousness and introspection. Those present-day Americans who are constantly examining the state of their psyches are, in this respect at least, descendants of the Puritans. The faithful reformer spent an inordinate amount of time in a painstakingly audit of his state of grace and gracelessness. He frequently kept a diary or journal in which he recorded every step forward and every dismissal, backsliding, a ledger of moral debits and credits, often written in cipher to preserve its secrets from prying mortal eyes. Even Cotton Mather, one of the greatest of the late Puritan leaders, confessed to his diary that he was tempted to, quote, self-pollution, end quote, suicide and blasphemy, was full of doubts and on occasion uncertain of the existence of God and of his own salvation. We might thus say that the reformer set out on the lonely and difficult task of learning and doing God's will. Quote, not my will be done, but not my will, but thy will, Lord, be done. Quote. He prayed if he did not always understand God's will or was not able to conform to it. He learned to live to a remarkable and perhaps unprecedented degree by his own will. This self-willed struggle proved to be an unusually demanding, endlessly challenging, and often exciting enterprise. The Reformation left its mark on every aspect of the personal and social life of the faithful, in the family, the education and business activity, in work, in community, and ultimately in politics. The consequences of the Reformation were determinative for American history. The quote, faithful, end quote, were to be sure most prominently located in the New England colonies, but they were by no means confined to that region. The Congregationalists were the classic Puritans in doctrine and church polity, but their Presbyterian neighbors were just as surely Calvinists. Quakers might differ in matters of theology, but they were perfect examples of the new consciousness produced by the Reformation, and some matters more Puritan than the Puritans. The Baptist rejection of infant baptism was anathema to other denominations. The Methodists were more rigorous about the indulgence of the senses. The Anglicans more tolerant or less pious depending on the point of view. The German Lutherans in Pennsylvania, like their master, eschewed the world as did the other pious sects, most of them German in origin. The Mennonites, Dunkards, Moravians, from the austerest Quaker to the most profligate Anglican, was an extended social and theological journey to be sure. But all along the spectrum of Reformed Christianity, one could find common denominations more important than all the differences. All partook of the Reformed consciousness. Today we are perhaps most aware of the negative aspects of that consciousness or character type that we understand to be our heritage from the Reformation. It is depicted as sour, austere, repressive, materialistic, competitive, anxious, arrogant, authoritarian, both defensive and aggressive, inhibited, excessively individualistic. And it may well be that the creative potentialities in that consciousness have been mined out, that what we presently experience in such a negative way are the unattractive residues that remained when the Puritans' zealous faith and passionate desire to redeem the world for the glory of God and had dwindled away. This is remote or repugnant as Puritanism may be to us today. It is essential that we understand that the Reformation in its full power was one of the great emancipations of history. Those who drew together under the new revelation unquestionably felt themselves filled with the grace of God and experienced the joy of creation in its deepest sense. Those who embraced the Reformed faith, or at least felt themselves to be truly liberated, they entered into a genuinely new world of the Spirit, and received in consequence the power to establish a geographically new world. Reformers were not simply men and women who just subscribed to a set of theological propositions, most of which seem thoroughly uncongenial or obscure to us today. They were men and women individuals in a a new sense, with a transcendent vision and the passionate determination to transform the world in accordance with that vision. The political consequences of the social attitudes engendered by the Reformation can be clearly seen in the English Civil War. The resistance of the radical Protestant elements in the British Parliament led to the Long Parliament, the overthrow of the Court Party, and eventually the beheading of the King and the dictatorship of Cromwell. In the strange and bloody episode, all the radical political propensities of the Reformed faith well to the surface. The Presbyterian and Puritan leaders in Parliament were comparatively mild in their doctrines when compared with the Diggers, Livers, and Fifth Monarchy men. The Diggers asserted, quote, "England is not a free people, till the poor that have no land have a free allowance to dig and labor on the commons," end quote. This, i.e., the public land. And Gerard Winstanley argued that the earth was a, quote, "common treasury of livelihood to whole mankind without respect of persons," end quote. Quote, "The community of mankind," end quote, "was the first community composed of all of those joined in, quote, the unity of spirit of love, which is called Christ in you, or the law written in the heart, leading mankind into all truth, and to be of one heart and one mind," end quote. The second was the, quote, "community of the earth, for the quiet livelihood in food and raiment, without using force or restraining one another. These two communities is the true leveling which Christ will work at his more glorious appearance. For Jesus Christ, the Savior of all men, is the greatest, first and truest leveler that ever was spoke of in the world," end quote. So it says the doctrines of the deliverers, discredited and ignored for more than 100 years, found expression in the classic phrase of the Declaration of Independence, quote, "All men are created equal," end quote. The right of resistance to unlawful authority, so clearly enunciated by the parliamentary leaders and confirmed by the Glorious Revolution of 1689, was the basis on which the Americans opposed the unlimited authority of Parliament over the British colonies. And there was another important aspect in which Reformed Christianity manifested itself in the political sphere. It brought with it a revival of the discussion of law, the law of nature, natural law, celestial law, and municipal or man-made law. This was a heritage that reached back to the ancients and that received its classical Christian formulation in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. However, the Reformation aroused a new interest in the nature and sanction of law, especially on the part of theologians of the Anglican Church. It was Richard Hooker, an Anglican divine, who wrote in his Celestial Polity the line, "Dangerous to kings and tyrants," quote, "Laws they are not, which public approbation have not made so," end quote. Protestant theologians and theorists incorporated into the political thought of the Reformation the great principles of natural law, which were to play such an important role in developing the theoretical foundations of colonial resistance to Parliament and of the federal constitution itself. The problem, as Richard Shaw suggests, that remains at the center of all the questions about the relation of human beings to the divine might be termed the problem of original sin versus Christian utopianism. Original sin involves the notion of an unchanging element in human nature, qualities of or characteristics, quote, "original," end quote, and continuing. Christian utopianism, on the other hand, might be said to be grounded in the injunction, quote, "love thy neighbor as thyself," end quote, and similar, quote, "impossible," end quote, demands. Christian theology has always been, in essence, a balancing of these claims. In no period of our history have they been more precisely weighed than in the era of the American Revolution. The founding fathers, believing for the most part in some form of the notion of original sin, nonetheless dared to believe also in a new and better age for all mankind. Thus the Reverend Samuel Thatcher could declare, quote, "Liberty is a pure, original emanation from the great source of life which animates the universe," end quote, and assert confidently that the benefits of the American Revolution could not, quote, be compressed within the compass of a few pages. Its effects are not confined to one age or country. The human mind has received a stimulus and attained an expansion which will extend its influence beyond calculation, end quote. Americans have, in short, begun the, quote, emancipation of the world, end quote. The federal constitution was, in effect, an effort to reconcile on the practical, political level original sin and Christian utopianism. In this context, the Declaration of Independence appears as the classical political credo of a utopianism whose Christian antecedents are plainly discernible. The American revolutionary tradition was soon reduced to a reiteration of, quote, freedom, equality, and liberty, end quote. Abstracted from revolutionary politics, these became in time merely pious utterances. Today, the challenge of the bicentennial era is, as the Founding Fathers most commonly put it, to return to first principles. For the Christian, the most important of these principles is that God rules the world, and that all human orders are merely efforts to emulate the divine order. It thus follows that the task of the Christian is always to be radical to the existing establishment, and conservative to secular revolutionaries, who, as Reinhold Niebuhr reminded us, are constantly attempting to make their ideal into the ultimate goal of history. For the Christian, this is heresy. The importance of Christianity is as an incommensurable, inexhaustible, I suspect irreplaceable, quote, readjuster, end quote, that which must survive every social upheaval, every revolution, every war. It is conterminous with history itself, or else it is nothing but a system of constellation, another, quote, world religion, end quote. In Richard Scholl's words, quote, the end, in this case, the end of the old order of king and parliament, is the occasion for a new beginning, and men are free to allow the old to die and trust that out of that death the new will emerge, end quote. This is faith in the future as governed by God, by God's will, which, even if men cannot discern it, is there. This is the primary original source of all, quote, utopian, end quote, thinking. The future will be better than the past. The bicentennial era, which has so discomforted academic historians, poses equally difficult questions for the Christian community. Because if the American Revolution is indeed inconceivable without the imperatives of radical Christianity, what does this fact suggest about the church or churches today? How is the complacent and conservative body of Christians to be aroused from its lethargy and made the active agent of the new age? It is probably safe to say that most anthologies are based on assumptions generally accepted by scholars in the field. Thus, an anthology of writing of Black Americans is based on the widely held view that attitudes and opinions of blacks, however sorely neglected they may have been in the past, are important to a proper understanding of our history. Similarly, a collection of political documents having to do with American constitutional history would contain a reasonable, clearly defined sort of documents, including, among other things, the federal constitution and certain key decisions of the Supreme Court. The case is somewhat different here. There has been no general acceptance by academic scholars of the centrality of Protestant Christianity to an understanding of the American Revolution. This theme has at best been dealt with by most scholars as a peripheral issue, alluded to in passing where it is mentioned at all. Therefore, the selection of materials in this anthology has been made in order to argue a case that has not yet been adequately argued. It might thus be called a, quote, didactic anthology, end quote, a work which presents a case not in the typical monographic style of analysis and exposition, but rather as a lawyer presents a brief by presenting to the reader the documents upon which the argument rests. We might say that the case of the primacy of Protestant Christianity in understanding the origins and nature of the American Revolution versus academic historians resets on the arguments herewith presented to the court of public opinion. I am, of course, well aware of the problems and dangers attendant upon such a method, but I risk them gladly, since at the least they may open a debate on this largely neglected question. So hopefully that interests you, So just gonna finish reading it, and so that's basically what the book is about. Sorry, I know it's very lengthy, but I think I'll stop there. So if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you and God bless.